Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to tonight's second half. Before we jump into tonight's second half, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It doesn't cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, folks, they really do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to tonight's second half, shall we? Today's first part of the upload. This encounter was told to me by one of my firearm instructors named Chris. In northern Idaho, deep in the Rocky Mountains, there's a cabin that runs a cattle ranch. Chris's brother knows the owner and invited Chris to spend the weekend up there for some hunting and hiking. The brothers gathered their supplies and a few of their best pals and took off into the mountains. As they were driving up the windy roads of Idaho, his brother issued a cryptic warning. Sometimes the cattle escape into the woods and need to be tracked down. The owner of the ranch has seen strange creatures in the forest, and I'm not messing around. Everyone laughed and didn't take the warning seriously. Within the hour, they arrived at the cabin. On the second day in the mountains, Chris decided to go on an afternoon hunt with one of his friends. They drove down the back road into the forest until the road ended a few miles from the cabin. They got out and walked to a nearby creek, then split off with one person going upstream and one person going downstream. After walking a little ways, Chris came to a silty deposit where he noticed a foul odor and a broken pine tree that was green and healthy. The trunk was snapped in one direction in the water. There were 4-finger indentations in the tree bark like it had been squeezed and pulled down by a massive hand. Sap bubbled from the compressed bark. On the ground he discovered numerous huge footprints with 5 toes stamped into the silt. He followed them and counted 73 beautiful tracks that led to another snapped green pine. This tree also had finger marks on it and was facing in the direction of the water. Tracks danced all around this tree. The smell was now overwhelming. Chris became so spooked that he immediately ran back to the truck. His friend had shot a deer, and they quickly drove back to the cabin with it. At the cabin, Chris explained the situation to everyone. That night, 6 men from the cabin armed themselves, each with a rifle and a pistol, and returned by truck at the end of the dirt road. They parked the truck facing the creek and walked on foot to the edge of the water. It was a moonless, starry night, but the horrible smell still lingered. The band of hunters waited, and at one point howled into the night, calling for the creature. Chris thought he could hear something moving in the forest, but the creek was too loud to be absolutely sure. He decided to walk alone upstream and into the woods to get a clearer sound. He could hear that there was definitely something big making its way through the pines. He ran back to the hunters and warned them that something was approaching. Moments later, from both up and downstream, they began to hear branches snapping and footsteps thudding. The sounds came from both directions, closing in on the group. The footsteps grew louder and louder until a booming crunch of a log under the surface of the mud spooked them so much that they all ran back to the truck. In less than 2 minutes, they made it back to the vehicle. The moment they fired up the truck and turned on the headlights, they could see two massive, bipedal, hairy creatures moving up the creek in the location they had just retreated from. The creatures' eyes shone from the truck's headlights. All of the men had clear shots, but all took flight back to the cabin in terror. The stench greeted them upon their return. They feared that with the slain deer outside, the creatures would be drawn to the property. They all slept curled up with their guns that night, but no more signs of the creature would be found. I told you, little brother, I was not screwing around. He figures he ran into a family of them. There was a wild look in his eyes as he turned to me and said, "I know they exist." Today's second encounter. A few months back, one of my friends opened up to me about a creature he had encountered 2 times around New Jersey, where my mother lives. This same friend and I had encountered something in the past while being in New Jersey. He told me that when he was a boy, he had saw something in the fields right next to his home. Whatever it was still terrifies him to this day. He's had 2 encounters with this creature, one in the middle of the day when he was a boy, and one waking up in the middle of the night. Here are his encounters with an alleged Dogman. These encounters are also from his perspective, so I could capture the narrative feel. I hope you enjoy these encounters. Hey, my name's Ted, and I lived in New Jersey all of my life. I've had all kinds of paranormal and creature experiences for a long time, which I can tell you here in the future at some point. I'm a heavy believer in the supernatural, and in Dogman and cryptids, just like my friend Sam. Here are my 2 encounters with what I think was a Dogman. It was a clear sunny day as I was walking along the trail that was close to my house. I was about 7 or 8 at the time. It was a beautiful day out, and as a young kid, I was taking it all in. I was having an adventure, picturing myself running through an open field, waiting for my mom and dad to get home. The trail I was on had beautiful scenery all around it, with tall grass and miles of fields to my left and dense forest to my right. I was just walking through the woods, as whenever my parents weren't home, that's what I used to do. I enjoyed walking, taking in the feel of nature. The smell of the woods was intoxicating, as well as the chirping birds. Then the woods fell silent. I felt like someone or something was watching me. My eyes began to dart around the entire area, then I looked to my left and noticed something in the tall grass. To me it looked just like a big dog, but then I saw it was crouched down like a man would be if he was hiding. It was covered in brown fur. Looked like it had a muzzle and ears just like a German shepherd. The eyes were blood red. I thought it was more curious than fighting to me, but I was still on edge. I was scared for a bit, but I acted like I didn't notice it and just went along with my day and ran back to my house. I never spoke about this encounter to any of my family, as they would have thought I was crazy, but that was my first encounter with what I believe was a Dogman. My second encounter happened about 4 or 5 years ago. At this point, I lived in a different house. This house was close to the forest, and the biggest predators I've seen around here had just been coyote or fox. Now, what I saw that night was no coyote. I woke up in the middle of the night with a dry throat and realized how thirsty I was, went to the kitchen to get some water, when I suddenly had a sense of dread and felt like I was being watched. I looked into the window close to where I was, and to my horror I saw this huge animal in my backyard. Whatever it was, it noticed me, and it was staring at me with these crimson red eyes. I felt utterly terrified, and to my horror, I saw the animal bare its teeth at me, stand up on 2 legs. This creature then started growling. I could hear it through the window as it was slightly opened. I also saw its breath come out of its mouth, and I realized that this was definitely real. It looked to be about 7 or 8 feet tall on its hind legs, with the head of a German shepherd and the body shaped just like a man. Whatever it was then looked at the fence in my yard, ran to it, jumped across into the woods below. I went back to my bedroom terrified and could not sleep for the rest of the night. These are my 2 encounters with these creatures. They have shook me to my core and made me realize that there are creatures that science just refuses to recognize. Today's 3rd encounter. First, a little bit of background so you can understand how freaked I actually am about this. A few years back, I camped in a weird little town, known to be the best access point to visit some gorgeous waterfalls and nice hiking trails in the region. This town is also known for paranormal activity, alien encounters, and weird stuff of the likes. And most of the residents and visitors are hippies. It's also known that people there would regularly use weed and hallucinogenics of all kinds. This was my first time camping there, at a little nice campsite on the edge of town, close to some brush and trees. I went with a few friends who had been there before, and they had filled me in on all of the weird encounters and phenomena that supposedly were common here. I'm not really a believer in the supernatural, but I also rather not treat certain things I don't fully grasp lightly, so I was a little uneasy about the stuff they told me. That's when I saw this creature. There was a man bent over in a weird position with a thick beard and messy long dreadlocks, standing in front of me, paralyzed by the light I was shining at his face. He had an utterly crazed and bizarre expression on his face I could not figure out, and I could see his pupils taking up almost the entirety of his clear iris. He must have been tripping balls, because that freeze lasted seconds before he gave me a look of sheer terror and ran off into the brush nearby, screaming his lungs out in some strange language I doubt exists. He woke up the rest of the campsite, about 10 other people, and I told them what I saw or heard. The veterans here just shrugged it off. The reason why I included that encounter is because personally I don't think that this guy or creature or feral human being was on any kind of drugs. I really think he was a feral human being. I think that there are a lot more encounters with these things that we know of. And to be honest with you guys, they really freak me out. I'd not rather deal with any of them, but if I was going to have to deal with something, I guess it would be a Sasquatch or a Dogman, because at least then I know that reality is completely screwed, rather than see some sort of weird, inbred, grotesque, crooked man speaking in tongue. I don't know about you, but that's just my thought on the matter. Anyway, moving on. Today's 4th part of the upload. Before I get into my encounter, I first would like to provide you with some background information that contributes to this. I'm Native American, and in my culture we have many myths, legends, and folklore. One example of folklore is my culture is the Skinwalker. For those who don't know, a Skinwalker can take form in various creatures. However, they will always be slightly different, like a cat with dog fur or dog with cat ears and human eyes. I've been told stories passed down for generations. As I begin to tell you this encounter, this is on a first-hand account, and everything you are about to hear is true. Now, that being said, let's get into it. When I was younger, my little brother and I had noticed an owl was following us around. We had noticed that this owl was not a regular-sized owl. The owl was roughly around 5 feet tall. We'd also noticed that it would linger around us and watch us. We had considered this to be normal. We never showed any form of fear or anything to the extent. My brother and I began to develop a belief that this owl was a form of a protector. My mom had mentioned that the owl had arrived around the time when we were born and began to follow us everywhere we went. When we were younger, we lived on a farm. Anytime we would throughout the land, the owl would be around us. Our mom had also told us about the same owl would sit on a stop sign at the end of the road if we had gone anywhere. When we would get closer to our house, the owl would follow the car back to our property. When we turned 13 years old, I noticed that the owl had stopped coming around the house or following us. When I was 16, I ended up getting into a huge argument with my dad and ended up staying at my mom's house for a good while. One night I had returned to my dad's house. It was my first time being at their house in months. As nighttime began to come, I noticed the same owl was at the house. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the owl outside. I went to check and saw the owl. I waved to the owl and began walking to my grandpa's house. During this time, the bathroom in my parents' house was being worked on, so we had to use my grandpa's house to use the restroom. As I started walking towards my grandfather's, the owl began to follow towards this house. In between the houses, there's a good amount of land, roughly about the length of a football field. As I continued walking to my grandparents' house with my dog, I noticed that the owl was alarmed and began hooting frantically. I looked up at the owl to see where it was, and then I looked down to see if there was anything around the area. As I'm doing so, I heard movement in the brush in the other field, the same field where the cows are located. I soon began to see this big black mass. This mass is roughly about 2 feet bigger than a Shetland pony. My dog had noticed it and began to growl and run. As I was walking toward the gate, I saw a normal-sized black dog that was not supposed to be there. The dog had began to run towards the stables where my dog ran. After the dog ran away, I continued walking towards my grandpa's house to use the bathroom. When I finished, I'd gone back outside and noticed my dog was standing on my grandfather's porch, visibly scared and shaking. I patted her to make sure she was okay and to calm her down. When she was calm enough, we began to walk back to my parents' house. As we were doing so, I heard a noise behind my grandpa's truck, which is roughly 20 feet away from the porch. I'd pulled out my knife that I would use as a form of self-defense if ever got attacked by an animal. I walked off the porch and approached the truck. As I approached the truck, I noticed a creature standing about 5 feet away from me. This creature looked somewhat like a dog, but it was not a dog. I then remembered that it was the same figure that I had seen in the field earlier. After coming out of a stage of shock, I realized that I'm standing 5 feet away from a medium horse-sized creature holding a knife while it's staring me down and growling. One of the first things I noticed was its front paws, but they didn't look like normal paws. They were elongated and had similar-looking fingers, and they were more spread out than a dog's paw. I had then noticed that its head slowly began to come out from the darkness. I had noticed its eyes, some brown but also whiter around the eye. It then begins to move closer to me. Its legs were shaped similar to a dog's. However, the creature's legs were more muscular like a human. I immediately reacted by throwing the knife at its paw. The creature had barely moved its paw fast enough to not get hit. I then hear the owl screech loud and the dog looks at me. I'm closing the distance between me and the creature. It then looks up as the owl begins to move above me and my dog. I had noticed that the creature was distracted by the owl. I had taken this opportunity to grab my knife and I made the attempt to stab at the creature. The creature jumped backwards to avoid the knife and runs back toward the field. I can hear the owl flying back toward the field where the creature had ran to. I slowly and cautiously made my way back towards my parents' house. As I approached the gate from the field into the yard, I hear a yelp and a loud thud, followed by a screech. I looked up and saw the owl from the cow field towards the tree sitting in the yard of my dad's house. When the owl had landed, I looked at the owl, and it had looked at me and began to hoot. As the owl did so, I ended up getting a feeling that the owl was telling me to go inside and everything was going to be okay. The next morning I woke up and went out to the field where the creature came from. I found a large patch of brush that had been flattened. There was no blood or carcass of the creature that tried to attack me. I had also noticed that the owl was not around the property. I'm now 22 years old and have not seen the owl or the creature since that night. My dad is still located on the same property that I grew up on, and I do visit frequently. After that night, I don't know what happened to the owl or the creature, but one thing that I do know is this event did occur. I fully believe that I encountered a Skinwalker. I also believe that the owl was there to protect me one last time. I don't know what to think about this encounter, and I've never shared it because I never thought anyone would actually listen or believe me. So, I guess here it is. Today's final, terrifying part of this upload. For some backstory, my dad is a retired park ranger, if that's what you call it. He worked for National Park Service up until 3 years ago. His usual task involved taking people on tours along the Appalachian Trail, maintaining the forest and the wildlife habitats that lived there. So anyway, this goes back to the summer of 2003 when my dad and a colleague, we'll call him John, were sent out to try to locate an adult elk. The male named Billy by the locals, who was usually very tame and was often found close to homes, but had not been seen for over a week. This was apparently very unusual for him. So my dad was dropped off along the trail while John took the truck and drove further down, approximately 5 miles, in order to try to locate Billy. They had been searching all day for him, and this is the last stop for the day, as there were only a few hours of daylight left. So, as the story goes, my dad had been walking along the trail for a little over an hour when he heard a disturbance in the distance off to the left. He could hear the snapping of tree branches, so he decided to follow where the noises was coming from, in the hopes that it was Billy, the elk. As they got closer, today's final encounter. Some backstory, my dad is a retired park ranger, if that's what you call it. He worked for the National Park Service up until 3 years ago. His usual task involved taking people on tours along the Appalachian Trail, maintaining the forest and the wildlife habitats that live there. So anyway, as the story goes, back in the summer of 2003, when my dad and his colleague, we'll call him John, were sent out to try to locate an adult deer, a male named Billy by the locals, who was usually very tame and often found close to the houses, but had not been seen for over a week, and this apparently was very unusual for him. So my dad was dropped off along the trail while John had took the truck further down the trail about 5 miles in order to try to locate Billy. They'd been searching all day for him, and this was the last stop of the day as there were a few hours of daylight left. So as the story goes, my dad had been walking this trail for a little over an hour when he heard a disturbance in the distance to his left. He could hear the snapping of tree branches, so he decided to follow where the noise was coming from, in hopes that it could be Billy the deer. As he got closer, he said he began to smell a foul odor, and instinctively knew that it was some sort of dead animal. He was right. Lying on the ground in a small opening of trees was the carcass of the large deer. He could see by the tag on one of the ears that it was Billy. However, he was immediately shocked by the condition the animal was in. Billy had been severely mutilated. His eyes and tongue were gouged out, his throat torn out, and his stomach had been ripped open, so that his intestines were protruding onto the ground. He also noticed little chunks of flesh had been bitten from the torso, and the entire front right leg was missing. He reasoned that the animal had been attacked by either a black bear or coyotes, as nothing else would be able to tackle a full-grown adult deer. However, this seemed strange because deer were usually too big for even apex predators to take down, but he thought that maybe a hungry pack of coyote may, if they were starving. What disturbed him further was the way in which the animal had been mutilated after death. My dad made a point of saying that he had never witnessed anything quite like it, and that it was very unusual for predators to mutilate a corpse in such a way. Feeling unnerved by this discovery, my dad radioed John and told him that he had located the animal before giving him the approximate location. John had told them that he had wandered off the beaten track, and that it would take him around an hour to get back to where the truck was parked and drive back to his location. So my dad was told to wait where he was until John found him. It was almost dark at this point. My dad remembered being very unsettled. He had a flashlight with him and some bear spray, but noted that he felt very vulnerable and alone in this forest. After around 15 minutes or so, he heard the same noise as he had earlier, much closer now that he was off the trail. He would hear footsteps and occasional growl of something hidden within the thick bushes straight ahead of him. He said that every so often he could hear slow breathing and the snapping of branches as whatever it was paced the forest floor. He began to feel like he was being watched, and worried that the coyotes, or perhaps even a bear, was now stalking him. He said that every so often he would wave his flashlight in the direction of the disturbance, and yell in order to try to scare whatever it was off. However, the noise still persisted, and this seemed to aggravate the creature. Luckily, the animal never came any closer or revealed itself to my dad, simply pacing around in the darkness and letting out an occasional growl. Over an hour later, a truck pulls up along the trail, and my dad could see to his relief that John was now following the flashlight to where my dad now stood. The arrival of another person must have spooked the creature, as he noticed hearing the crunching of the leaves now moving quickly away from him. He told John what had happened, and the man reasoned that it may have been a bear, and that they probably shouldn't hang out there. Together, they wrapped the corpse up in a tarp and managed to haul it onto the back of the truck. My dad said just as they were getting to leave, curiosity came over him, and he decided to walk over where the sounds were coming from, only moments before. John got out as well, and the two of them scoured the area. Behind the fallen log, they found a half-chewed leg of the deer. Dad has told me that not a day goes by that he doesn't think about what he saw that day in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere. We relocated from that area in 2005 and now reside in Richmond, VA. My dad hasn't been back since and said he will never walk the Appalachian Trail again. I can't blame him, to be honest. Anyway, that's my dad's encounter. Thank you. Here's a brief bonus encounter. Hey everyone, I'm going to tell you about the time I honestly think I saw Dogman. It was a really dark night. Me and my dad went out to the cornfield to look at some stars. It was going well until we heard something in the woods. We didn't mind it, knowing that it could be a deer, so we went back to looking at the stars. But then I heard a growl. My dad heard it as well because he was looking in the direction from where it came from. what still haunts me to this day. I saw what looked like a 7-foot tall man, except it was covered in thick black fur, and it had a wolf-like head and bent back legs just like a dog. Its yellow eyes stared at us. I stood in shock, but my dad whipped out his pistol and shot at it. The creature gave off an inhuman scream and ran into the woods. Me and my dad took off to the house. I've never told anybody about this beside my mom and my girlfriend. And there you have it, folks. Tonight's second half. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is, after all, your support that keeps this channel growing and going, and honestly what gives people a place to share their experiences, ideas, and theories, judgment and ridicule free. Thank you. Everyone stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real, they are out there, and they are dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for answers, and God bless.